Hello, everyone, and welcome to Diversity Matters, the show where we spotlight the people, ideas, and conversations shaping a more inclusive and impactful future in housing and beyond. I'm your host, Teresa Palacio Smith, Chief Inclusion Officer and Engagement Officer for Home Services of America. And as we celebrate Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Month, today's conversation is an especially important one because when we better understand the communities we serve, we build stronger relationships, create greater opportunity, and lead with deeper purpose. And I had the pleasure of meeting today's guests, Dr. Karthick Ramakrishnan, during AREAA's recent policy summit in Washington, D.C., where he did just an astounding job. Karthik, in really interpreting the key insights from AREAA's newly released State of Asia America Housing Report, while also sharing some powerful perspectives from his own work through AAPI data. And Karthik has become, and I'm calling Karthik because his last name is so hard to pronounce that I wanted to make sure I gave it just duty. He's become one of the nation's most trusted and credible voices in helping us better understand the demographic changes, public policy, civic engagement, and the lived experiences impacting Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. And housing, for all of us, we know that are watching this show, that it's the most powerful driver of financial stability, generational wealth, and opportunity. But not every community experiences housing the same way. There's cultural values, multi-generational living, caregiving responsibilities, language access, and also economic realities that shape how families approach homeownership. And that's exactly why today's conversation matters more than any day. Dr. Karthik, welcome to Diversity Matters. I'm so glad you're here, and I appreciate the time you've taken to really kind of help us understand what's happening in the AANHPI community and how we can really help serve that community better.
Thanks for having me, Teresa. Excited for the conversation.
Well, I really want to begin with you. You built an extraordinary career at the intersection of research, public policy, civic engagement, and I had no idea who you were until I met you at AREA. And I love the way you tell the stories of the demographics that you've studied so well. What first sparked your passion for this work, and what continues to drive that today?
To say for background, I'm an immigrant myself. Why do I care about immigrant communities? Part of it, you could say, is personal. I was born in India and then I moved to Canada at age 10 and then to the US at age 12. So I would say that's a big part of the motivation. Not only to be able to better understand the immigrant experience, but also to be able to communicate that effectively with the larger society, right? So that I would say that goes back that deep. I went to undergrad at Brown, where I studied international relations, and I started grad school at Princeton thinking I would do international politics. But then I shifted my attention to studying the civic engagement of immigrants in the US. And then I also added demography as part of my training. And that's where I really built up a lot of expertise in survey research, statistical analysis, and also public writing. I was a columnist in the Daily Princetonian, and I saw firsthand how important it is not only to build expertise, but to be able to share that expertise. And
Well,
so at API Data, we have this framework that we call data narrative action, DNA for short. That's our DNA. We want that to be everyone's DNA, where the data is so critical and central, but we don't stop at just data. We need to make sense of it, which is where narrative comes in, meaning making. And then we need to translate that into a strategic course of action. So, that in a nutshell is our philosophy, and it all comes back to me trying to make sure that immigrant communities are better understood.
well, first of all, your wealth of knowledge. I'm so impressed with your background. The fact that you moved to two different countries from India totally different cultures, even though a lot of people say that Canada and the US are very similar, very different
Oh, they're
in the way
different.
they, right? And so relocating at such a young, vulnerable age, and then understanding the nuances in the communities, I think that is why data and storytelling and how the that explains the numbers is so important in the work that you do. And again, I am so one of my favorite AREAA is one of my favorite organizations for the reason that I love all the different cultures that make up that community. And a lot of people don't understand very different nuances between each of those communities that the Asian population is made up. So why is it so important that disintegrated data matters so much, especially when community are often grouped together under one broad label? Because it happens to Hispanics as well, Latinos, right? So tell me why that's so important.
Yeah, so first of all, it's important to say that yes, Asian Americans are a group, right? Just like white is a category, or Hispanic slash Latino is a category, Black is a category. So these categories have meaning. So, before I get to why is it important to separate out, why is it that we're putting Indians in the same basket as Vietnamese, in the same basket as Japanese? These are completely different, not just cultures, but civilizations. People look very different from each other, different languages, different religions. So why does it even make sense to talk about that all as one? Well, I wrote an article about it, an academic article with Jennifer Lee, that's called "What Counts as Asian." And sadly, it was our country's long history of racially exclusionary laws. If you were deemed Asian, you could not become a US citizen until the 1940s if you were an immigrant. And so that still carries weight. Now, the reason why we do survey research on this diverse populations is we don't want to think that diversity means you can't talk about them as one group or that they'll forever be diverse. So what we find is that there are some areas where you see convergence in these populations, and then other areas where you see big divergence, right? When it comes to educational attainment, when it comes to poverty levels, when it comes to language needs, when it comes to overcrowded housing, when it comes to rent burden. So you see some very big differences when you're able to separate out this very broad category that these globally represent billions of people. In the US represents tens of millions of people with very different socioeconomic experiences. And so that's why it's really important to be able to distinguish. And when you drill down specifically into economic matters and housing matters, there are major differences by group and by geography. And if we weren't able to disaggregate, meaning to split up the population into these meaningful categories, we're missing out on not only the tremendous diversity, but major areas of disadvantage in the community that we need to pay attention to.
And that's such an important point, Karthik, because one size fits all thinking can lead to one size fits all solutions. And that's not the way we need to, operate and we need to approach, the different groups within the US, right? And you recently spoke at AREAA's Policy Summit on their newly released State of Asia America Housing Report. And I thought, first of all, I love the report every year. It always brings a fresh perspective, numbers. They really do a deep dive into where, migration patterns are happening, the economic, households that they operate under that Asia report. From your perspective, what were some of the most important themes or findings that stood out to you in this report? And I don't know if you've have kept up with the reports, but to me, it's very fascinating. I love all the information that is provided, in that report.
Absolutely. That report brings together different types of research and findings together. And for that reason alone, it's so important. And the fact that they update it over time is also super helpful. One thing that stood out to me was the immense wealth building power that homeownership can bring. And this, draws on findings from the Urban Institute that AREAA had also commissioned. And we were fortunate to not only read the report, but to have one of the main authors write a blog post at API Data. So if people go to apidata.com/blog, they'll see, you know, outside from reading the report from the authors, kind of the main take there. But I mean, so it still remains true that homeownership, especially first-time homeownership, can be powerful in terms of wealth building. And then as an intergenerational strategy, right, it can be even stronger. That said, there are warning signs, right, in the report, and we see that in our survey data. So for the past year and a half, we've seen in our survey data that affordability is a huge issue, including affordability when it comes to housing. We also see pessimism that's creeping up in our survey results, where people aren't sure that the younger generation is going to be better off than the older generation. So even though we know that housing is an important aspect of intergenerational wealth building, people are worried not only about their present circumstances, but about their future as well.
Well, and you're seeing that even through the, report and that housing realities are really impacting even the broader market. So all those that you mentioned are happening, but particularly the numbers in delayed home ownership, right? Can we even buy a home? And now it's taking even longer, 10 years. Now the average is what, 40? The shared financial strategies, they've all always existed, but you're looking at the multi-generational living, which is a huge part of that community. It's also part of my community, the Latino community. That's a big part. We will purchase a home that includes cousins, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, grandparents, right? And all live in one. So how do you see that affecting and what impact can we have and the industry could do better to understand these numbers, these dynamics, and also these lived experiences?
Yeah, no, thank you for elevating that. When we look at not only that report, but if people, we have this thing called a community data explorer. And one of the indicators we have, one of the housing indicators is multi-generational living, three or more generations living in the same household. And we see, right, that for Asian, Pacific Islander, Latino communities, it's more so than the average. First, let's talk about why that's the case, and then two, how can people better serve communities that have this kind of market demand? One is it's a mix of cultural preferences, but also economic realities, right? And it's not just the economic reality when it comes to the cost of housing, it's the cost of childcare. It is the cost of elder care. It is, if you're talking about people with immigrant parents that didn't qualify for Medicare, you need to have the person in the house to be able to take care of them because they can't afford, right, to pay out of pocket for those needs. So, the kind of sandwich generation that many people talk about, it is so real in our communities. At the same time, there are benefits from intergenerational living as well. Cultural knowledge transmission is so important. So those are some of the reasons why you see it more likely in immigrant heavy communities than in other communities. Now, what does it mean for builders and real estate agents and others to cater to this market? Well, it means that the particular configurations of bedrooms, common spaces, different groups have different religious preferences and needs. I know, for example, in Hindu communities, they like to have what's called a puja room. That's the place where they have images of different gods to be able to pray. How do you find that in a typical floor plan, right? And so that's something in places with high concentrations of particular communities, especially particular religious communities that might need to have particular needs, people need to be attuned to that, especially when it comes to multi-generational households. I also want to flag that it's important when we talk about multi-generational living that we also pay attention to overcrowded housing. That's in some ways, the kind of one of the less desirable aspects, right? When people do it out of economic necessity and they're doubling up, sometimes tripling up in bedrooms, That's a problem. We saw this most vividly during COVID. People were not able to socially isolate when they got sick. This was particularly true for Pacific Islander communities. Why did we see high infection rates and death rates among Pacific Islanders? It's because people could not socially isolate themselves when they got sick. So we need to find ways to relieve the housing cost burden, and there are a variety of solutions. And to make sure that if people are engaged, participating in multi-generational living, they're doing so in contexts where it does not include overcrowded housing or severely overcrowded housing.
It's so true. And, you brought up a great point in that, when you look at, especially with most of the communities that we're talking about, tend to gravitate to larger cities, right? Now you're seeing a lot of migration out of California, for example, to Texas, right? Because of the cost of living and because it's the housing, you're able to purchase more for your housing in those areas. And reasons that you also mention is the number of rooms, right? Residences that can actually increase the opportunity for people to live in their own space, right? Where they're not crowded and those such scenarios are not happening. One thing that I know really helps that you're doing and you're working on is really understanding the data, but also making sure that government understands that data and advocating on that on that point, because we're seeing disaggregated, I can't say the word,
Aggregated.
disaggregated data disappear, especially when it comes to the different communities. So how concerning is that from policy and advocacy standpoint, and what can we all do to make sure that we're not losing the visibility into the subgroups and, and the risk that that can create by doing so?
Absolutely. So a lot of people think about race as only about equity. Race is also just about smart business decision making. It's understanding people and not only their cultures, but their worldviews and their lived experiences and tailoring goods and services according to their needs. It's ultimately just about understanding consumer markets, plain and simple, right? As a public policy researcher, when we talk about building smart policies, we talk about the three E's, right? Effectiveness, efficiency, and equity. Say you don't care about equity. You probably care about effectiveness. You probably care about efficiency. If you're not collecting the data to understand your customers, you are not going to be doing anything that is effective. You're going to be very inefficient in trying to address the needs of that customer base. And so it boggles the mind that we would take away data and intelligence that can help us better understand, track, address, either anticipate or on the back end, make up for any bad planning decisions that have been made. So it doesn't make sense except if people approach data from an ideological lens. And this is something I'll say. I'm a former professor, strongly believe that we need to follow the evidence and have critical dialogue. Ideology, which is essentially these assumptions, and then you're just going to push your perspective regardless of the data and evidence, doesn't serve anyone. Because what it does is it leads to plans that ultimately do not address the underlying issue, market demand, or problems that exist. So that is why so it is really concerning that the federal government is backtracking in its collection of data, including on lending and on housing. We are going to be starting to operating blind in many of these markets with very diverse populations and not being able to understand whether they're being served and how they can be more effectively served.
And we're seeing that already. I mean, we're seeing that there's almost like, put your, head in the sand type mentality and not realizing the opportunities that there is in working together, right? And you've got a lot of policy and civic engagement, work that you've been involved in. So what should housing leaders like myself and others, pay closer attention to right now if we want to create more sustainable and pathways to homeownership for those communities that we're serving?
Yeah, first I'll just say, we're API data. So first we'll talk about data and data policies and practices. We need to make sure that we continue to collect good data, but also that we find ways to protect data. So we released a report called Safety First, and we have a framework called the SMART Data Framework. And the S in SMART, it's SMARTT, by the way, there's an extra T there, but the S stands for safety. People want to make sure that the information that they're sharing will be kept confidential or that they understand how the data are going to be used. It's just a good practice. Doesn't mean don't collect the data, but just tell people how we're going to be using the data. But we need to make sure that we're collecting helpful data so that we can better understand and serve the needs of these communities. Beyond that, there's a range of housing solutions. Now, I don't want to speak as API data. I'm also a public policy researcher, so maybe I'll wear that hat. We know that when it comes to housing affordability, it's a massive concern, especially in high density areas. Happens to be that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders live in some of the most expensive housing markets in the country. That's just traditionally where they've been, but also where you see a lot of the job growth, where they're going to, even if it starts affordable. When you talked about Texas, Austin used to be affordable. It's no
Oh,
longer, right? Houston too. So many of these places you see spread outside of established areas because affordability is a problem. So partly it's about a lot of it is about supply. It is also about ensuring that whatever mechanisms, right, either some kind of builder incentive or housing vouchers or something else to make sure that people are able to afford to live. I'll say the intergenerational aspect is so important. Less and less, basically we're seeing that Americans are less and less likely to be able to live in the same neighborhood where they grew up. And that's a tragedy. When you talk about the importance of these intergenerational bonds that matter, it's so important to be at least have the option of living and buying property in the area where you grew up in. And so that's, we have to make sure that we, you know, make sure that we're, environmentally sustainable, making sure that people are being paid well. Like labor and environment regulations have a role, but when they start delaying tremendously and significantly increasing the cost of any new building, then you're pricing things out for most residents. So we just need to be smart about the policies that we have implemented already and be careful about new policies and make sure that affordability is top of everyone's mind when it comes to housing policy.
and it's such a domino effect. I mean, everything you're saying is built on the fact that and I always explain it to someone like when you buy a house, you want equity to grow, right? You want your appreciation to grow. At the same time, you don't want it to go out of balance. Although a lot of people have taken advantage of that. California for many years, oh my God, their appreciation was 20, 30, 40%. That's just unrealistic to be able to maintain affordability and for someone new coming in to be able to buy at the level that you are now at. And then if they do, then they can't go down it when someone else is trying to buy it at a lower level because now you're underwater in your own home. So it's almost like, how do you get out of this, right? I totally understand it. I totally see that we need to have solutions that are viable, that will work, and that will look at not greed, because then you see builders saying, "Oh, I'm gonna price this at 1.5 million," and you're like, "Wait a minute, who can afford that?" I mean, honestly, who can
You know what?
afford?
Yeah, well, so one solution we're seeing that's promising is ADUs, right? Accessory dwelling units. And I know certainly in California, but in a few other states, we're seeing a significant increase in certain metros where people are using it either, for supplemental income, but there's still someone, living in that ADU, or for older family members, right? to be nearby, or whatever that intergenerational transfer looks like, where the parents might have been in the main house, but then they're able to have the kids live in it, and then they can live in the ADU. We have to have solutions like that to make sure that there's greater flexibility within housing, within certain metro areas, and not thinking that, oh, I'm going to move to a low cost state because I can no longer, even if my house is appreciated, I need to do this in order to cash out and just move completely different.
Again, totally understand because that does happen. And ADUs are not allowed in every state. There are only certain areas in the cities that are allowing the ADUs to be built. In so many other areas of the country, you're not able to do that, which to me is crazy. And also, one last thing that I want to discuss because Hope was telling me that even scenarios that people don't get or understand is like, let's say you have a home, you and your spouse have lived in it for 40 years, you've paid it off, and now you're retired. Then you need the money. You don't want to leave your home, right? But you want to be able to pull the money, whatever to the equity you've built on that property so that you can use it for other items, and yet you don't qualify because now you're retired. And so there's things that we got to change um, without being a predatory lender coming in and doing something that takes the whole,
Yeah.
equity and actually, um,
Teresa, one thing I want to make sure to mention that we haven't talked about yet is language access.
and that's yes.
Yeah, so just want to make sure that we get in there while we have time. So there was the administration put out an executive order, and there have been some agencies that have scaled back in providing language translation, right? Including on important housing related documents where people might not fully understand what they're signing. This is a major problem. Again, it hurts businesses, right? And people might say, well, this is America, everyone should speak English. Well, guess what? Most immigrants want to speak English. Just because you have a rudimentary understanding of English does not mean you're prepared to sign legal financial documents in English. So we have to make sure that we're providing that access. Now, thankfully, private industry realizes that you cannot do business in America without meeting people where they're at and understanding the customer and making sure that the customer is comfortable in handling that financial and legal transaction.
One of the biggest investments you're going to make, right, in your lifetime for most people. And I always relate it to if you travel to another country and let's say something happens to you there and you are incarcerated for whatever reason, and it's not something, and then they're asking you to sign something in another language. Maybe you speak the language, but the legal documentation, you got to know what that is. And it's better if you're able to understand it in your own language. So that's how I always say it's so important for us to be able to understand why that's critical because a lot of immigrants, my mother never spoke English, and it wasn't that she didn't want to, it's just she was literally scared, I think, of speaking English because she felt like she would have a thick accent and that people were not going to be able to understand her. And
Absolutely.
so,
Yeah.
but she understood everything someone was saying to her. It was just the language, the intimidation piece was really hard for her. So understanding that about each culture and understanding why that's important is really critical to be able to serve the communities and to help them get into home ownership. I can't believe it, but we're really almost out of time. And one of the things that I always love to do is do like a fun section, Karthik, where we're just running. I learn more about you. And first of all, before I move forward, I want to know where do we get you said safety and smart, the program that you talked
Yes,
about?
a smart data framework. If you just go to apidata.com, you'll see it on our main page. If you don't see it on our main page, you can look at our reports and it'll be there. We think it'll be a helpful framework. If you also go to our main page, you can see buttons for our survey data, our community data explorer. Play around with your data. You will learn so much. I learn every time I click on that community data explorer. I learn something new. About our community because it's a fast growing but a dynamic community. and you will be surprised. Even if you think you know, you can play a little bit of trivia with yourself. How well do you know your market? You can check it out. We have data not only nationally, but by state, by county, and you can break it down with different Asian and Pacific Islander
I
populations.
am definitely going to pull that aapidata.com so that people can access that information. Thank you for sharing that for sure. So here we go. So fast five, just quick. What is a book or podcast or resource that has influenced your thinking?
Hmm. Oh my God. This I don't know if this is gonna be a fast one. I don't listen to podcasts. My wife listens to that a lot more. But I always New York Times is my go-to. And the opinion section, including all the diverse opinions there, including from conservatives and liberals, to understand the differences in perspective there.
I love it. A place in the world that inspires you.
Oh, I Spain. I would love to.
Wow.
And now that I've like, yeah, decent enough in Spanish, I would love to explore that more. Because there's actually a lot of different cultures that have influenced Spain over the years.
Beautiful, beautiful. I just got back from Malaga. So
Mm.
just a beautiful place. I couldn't agree with you more. How about a leader or mentor that has really shaped your has shaped you?
Manuel Pastor is a professor and researcher at USC, and he does a lot of work in advising foundations in terms of how to make smart investments. So that's someone who I have looked up to over the years.
Manure Pastor.
Yeah.
I love that. All right, coffee, tea, or something totally different.
Coffee for sure. I'm South Indian. People think Indians drink tea, and they do in North India, but in South India, it's coffee.
Colombians love coffee too, so I get that. And one word you hope defines your legacy.
Impact.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for being with us today, Karthik. This conversation reminds me that our leadership begins with understanding, begins with understanding data and understanding people, and also those lived experiences behind that data. And that the barriers and opportunities that shape access to home ownership are there because housing is never just about property, right? It's about stability, it's about legacy, it's about opportunity. And that's what we really need to keep in mind when we're working with the different communities that we're serving in the different parts of the world that we're in. And to our audience, thank you for joining us for special AANHPI Heritage Month edition of Diversity Matters. If today's conversation gave you a new perspective, I encourage you to share it with a colleague, your team, or your network. Uh, just know that when we deepen our understanding, we strengthen our impact. Thanks again, Karthik. It was great to have you on the show. Great for all the information that you shared with us. And for all of you, I'm Teresa Palacio Smith, and this has been Diversity Matters.